It is November the 10th, 1:02 p.m. here on the west coast of the United States. My name is Arthur Asadurian. This is the Apologia Center weekly live podcast, Q&A, interviews that we bring in various guests, and we pick their brains because they are brains to be picked, and we'll talk about whether that's a thing that could be even picked today or not. So I don't want to take any more of our time because I'm excited for this because I've gotten to spend some time in a car ride. We spent kind of the weekend together, but the car ride was my favorite part because it was just the two of us. So Eric Hernandez, welcome to the Apologia Center podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, brother. It's good to be on with you.
Well, we started that off by saying we're picking brains, but maybe it's minds that we need to be picking instead of brains.
Yeah. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine when people use that kind of language. My usual response to when people, it's probably why you said it too. When people say, "Can I pick your brain?" I usually ask, "Why would you want to do that? My brain's just matter and fluid. I'll let you pick my mind instead."
Correct. Yeah. That is proper. I regularly catch myself in saying stuff like that, and then going, "Well, I don't really believe that, so I need to change what that's about." Eric, I'm going to read a quick bio of yours that's on your website, and then we'll go beyond that. I think it'll be kind of a free flowing thing. So, folks, just to introduce you guys to Eric. Eric is an evangelist and apologist. What I love about Eric is that apologetics is a tool for evangelism that he does. And I think that's a proper view of apologetics and the way we should do apologetics. He is the apologetics lead and millennial specialist for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. So if you're in Texas and you're involved with some churches in Texas, make sure you get in contact with Eric. He does a great job of communicating the gospel, communicating and answering the questions that people have. I don't want to just put that into a category of millennials and stuff like that. These are just questions that people have. Eric, you work with Leighton Flowers, and you are you're a very good debater. Let me just say
Thank
that.
you.
And you've debated a host of people, but maybe two of them that a lot of people might be familiar with are Matt Dillahunty from the Atheist Experience, right? And Aaron Raw. Aaron Raw is a character. For those who have are aware of Aaron Raw, and again, some these debates sometimes are formal, sometimes they're kind of supposed to be formal. They never end up being formal. I suppose that really depends on who you're asking. You're married, and last I checked, you have 2 kids.
That's right.
Okay. Well,
boy and girl. That's right.
You got a busy life. You travel quite a bit.
Yes. Yeah. And what I love about my job is when I am on the road quite a bit, they let me just stay home and don't have to come into the office and just either work from home or just take some time off and spend it with my family.
Amazing. That is always good, man. It's always good being a part of a team that understands that, because people don't like generally like travel time, being in an airplane, being in a car, driving somewhere, and you live in a big state, the biggest state. Some might argue the best state.
That's right.
Floridans might disagree with that, but hey, what do we know?
But yeah, family, it's always my first ministry. And as you know, we always need to keep that in mind.
Amen to that, brother. Amen to that. So let's start off, I guess, where we started this conversation off with that little joke. What is the mind?
Yeah, so good question. And you know, my introduction to even this was essentially, to give some background context, was my freshman year of college. I took my first philosophy class and loved it. Found out my professor was an atheist. Next semester, I intentionally took another philosophy class, but from also an atheist professor, who people warned me not to take his class because how antagonistic he was and condescending. But you know, I call me crazy, but I've always believed that all truth is grounded in God in one way or another. So I wanted to take his class because, although I still had questions about Christianity, I knew that if Christianity were true, I needed to know why. But I also knew that if Christianity was false, I'd still like to know why, and perhaps this guy's the man for the job. So to try to be brief on that, the pivotal day in class in my life and ministry was when he essentially gave the following argument. He pulls out an antidepressant pill, and he basically says, well, the soul, according to religion, is immaterial, and this is what gives us hope in an afterlife. But then he said, and according to Christianity, your emotions and states and beliefs and all these things are within your alleged immaterial soul, and these are also immaterial. But the problem was, he said, if I took this antidepressant pill, it has the power to affect and change the alleged immaterial states of my soul. But how can that be? How can something tiny and physical affect the immaterial? Because when you look at the body, you look at the brain, he said scientists never find anything even remotely close like a soul. All they find are physical elements, carbon, hydrogen, neurons firing. There's nothing immaterial that they find. And he basically says, well, how can we explain that? And he essentially said, well, the answer is simple. The answer is that there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. We're just a physical brain and body, and we need to learn to live with this fact, get on with our lives, and stop believing these foolish fairy tales. And what really bothered me was, well, first, I had never met anyone that didn't believe in the soul. I thought everyone did, and I had never, much less, heard an argument given against it. And what troubled me was, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, essentially, if there's no resurrection, then Christianity is false. Well, when you look at the concept of resurrection, yes, it's a physical resurrection, but you're also more than physical. Paul alludes to an intermediate state of existence
Correct.
where we will exist without a body. So there's going to be this time period. If you die right now, prior to the final resurrection, you will exist, but disembodied. Paul refers to this as a state of nakedness. And that gets into other problems we can maybe get into later regarding resurrection, is that, well, if there's no resurrection, Christianity is false. And I'd say by the same token, if there's no soul, then how could there be a resurrection? And I would say by the same line of reasoning, Christianity would be false. So basically, so here I sit in class and I'm thinking, well, I can either ignore this, brush it under the rug, or I can roll up my sleeves and do some metaphysics and learn some philosophy. And that's essentially what I did. I'm not one to just ignore things. And then so I kind of started just looking into stuff, didn't know what apologetics was, and heard of this guy named J.P. Moreland that this other apologist philosopher, William Lane Craig, kept mentioning when it came to the soul. So, I bought some of his stuff and I loved it. I mean, I fell in love with his work, and it was a real breath of fresh air for me. So, that being said, to your question about the mind, what is the mind, and even what is a soul? What's the relationship there? Well, let's start with the definition of the soul. I hold to what's known as substance dualism, and what my professor was arguing for would be something known as physicalism. So, starting with the latter, physicalism is the belief that, essentially, what my professor said, that everything is physical about human beings. So, if your audience is familiar with the worldview of naturalism, which essentially we could say is the idea that only the natural world exists, nothing like God or angels or demons, nothing like that exists. Everything is natural. And when you apply this ontology, this perspective of existence to human beings, you get what's called physicalism. And the strictest form of physicalism is something like what my professor held to, which is everything is physical. All the properties, parts, substances, everything is physical. And again, apply that to human beings, well, we're just physical objects. Well, substance dualism would argue that no, while there is a physical aspect to our existence, there is also something immaterial. So dualism just means twoism.
Mhm.
And substance dualism is the idea that I am a substance, an immaterial substance, and then I have a body, which is something physical. And while I wouldn't call the body a substance, we could just say it's a physical thing that, while embodied, you could say makes us up. So I am a soul that has a body. That is a substance dualist position. Now, within substance dualism, and you tell me when to slow down or when to stop
You're
and
doing fine,
expand on
man.
something.
Keep it up.
So I am a soul, and the mind is what's called a faculty or capacity of the soul. And again, we can break these down a little bit further briefly in a little bit. But essentially, so what is consciousness? Now, consciousness is one of those things that you would define ostensively. That means you point to or give an example of it. So I could put it this way. If you encountered someone who was born blind, how would you define the color purple to them? Well, you couldn't, because they have no awareness of the color purple.
Correct.
So colors are even things that you would have to define ostensibly. You have to point to something and say, like behind me, that's purple. You give an example. Consciousness is defined the same way. Now, there are 5 states of consciousness, and even that word state is a technical term in metaphysics. There are substances, states, and properties. To grasp the concept, consider something like water. Water is a substance that can come in 3 different states, and each state is characterized by its particular properties. So when water is in a hard state, it has a property of being hard or solid. When water is in a liquid state, it has a property of being fluid, and gas state, vaporous, and so on and so forth. Now, I am a substance. The soul is we can define as an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. And when I teach on the question of the soul, I say there's really just 2 basic points you need to make. The first point is, or the first contention, if you will, is that consciousness is not physical. And the second contention is that I am more than a brain and body. I am something more than that, namely, I am a soul. So let's start with the first, that consciousness is not physical. There are 5 states of consciousness, and like I said, you define it ostensibly. So I, as a substance, have a faculty of mind, and my mind can come in 5 different states. Those 5 states, you can have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will, or you can just call it volition. So thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will. Now, how do we know that there's 5? Well, this gets into something. Here's going to be the foundation for this entire discussion to kind of to follow it with the arguments that I'll be using. So when you think of questions about philosophy of mind, which is what we're essentially talking about, your typical naturalist and whatnot, atheist, what they typically like to do is they'll say, well, what does neuroscience have to say? Or what does science have to say about, these kind of things? And essentially what my point to that is that this is the wrong tool for the assessment. It's the wrong question to ask. Why is that? Well, for a few reasons. An illustration I once heard was the following. Say you overhear your neighbors arguing and you approach them and you want to try to help settle their dispute, see what the argument's about. And essentially you find out that one of them has claimed that there's an invisible man living in his house. And the other neighbor says, well, I'll come investigate for you. And a few hours later, he comes out the house and he's upset and he's calling his neighbor a liar. So you find out, okay, well, how did this start? He says, well, after he told me there was an invisible man, I went to go investigate. And then he says this. He says, I looked for hours and hours, and I never once saw an invisible man. And I promise you, I looked everywhere. I looked in the closet, I looked under the bed, I looked in the bathroom, and not once did I ever see the invisible man. And of course, the other neighbor is like confused and just aggravated and says, well, of course you didn't see him. He's invisible. Now, the point to this is we can all know and agree that what this neighbor has said in his defense is true. If there is an invisible man, you wouldn't be able to see him, so you cannot use your sense of visibility to argue there is no invisible man. Now, this doesn't prove that this guy is right, but it does prove that you cannot use your sense of sight to try and disprove the existence of an invisible man.
Correct.
By the same token, if the soul exists, it is non-physical. And to try and use what's known as empiricism, which is a view that knowledge is attainable only through the 5 senses, to try and see, touch, taste, smell, etc., this is similar to a stronghold known as scientism, which is a view that science is the only way to gain knowledge about reality. And the problem with that is that if the soul exists, it is non-physical. Whereas science, though a wonderful tool for investigating the physical world, it is a tool that is limited to only studying the physical world. So if the soul exists and is non-physical, then you cannot use a discipline like science, which is limited to the physical, to try and investigate something non-physical. This is what we call in philosophy a category fallacy. It'd be like trying to use a ruler to measure your weight. It's the wrong tool for the assessment. So what is the right tool? Well, logic, reason, and philosophy. And this is where we can get into some philosophy known as Leibniz's law of identity. Let me see. Can I share my screen here?
Yeah, go for it. Let me see if I can pull that up.
I believe so. Let's see. And I think so. Because I just remembered I have some slides I could just throw in there. Okay. So I'll just do the entire screen. All right. Can you see this? Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it. The audience
Okay,
can't see it for some reason. Hang on.
no worries. And essentially, what we're
Then
going to get into talking about is what is known as Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. That's the big $5 word
okay.
for it. Is it ready?
No, it's what you're sharing right now is your personal. Okay, so that we
Okay,
can see. Just don't change out of that.
okay, gotcha.
And
Sorry.
so let me see if I can
All
pull
right.
that up. There it is. Okay.
Okay. So like I said, and you can see this?
Yes.
All right. So like I said, it'd be the wrong tool for the assessment. So what we're going to talk about is known as the Leibniz's law of identity, which you can just call it law of identity, or some people call it Leibniz's law. And essentially, Leibniz's law of identity states the following. Our 2 points to reiterate is consciousness is not physical, and I am more than a brain and body. So according to Leibniz's law of identity, if you have two things in question, say some A and some B, now, if they're the same thing, so if they're identical, and in philosophy, when we say identical, we mean literally the same thing as. So if I said Eric Hernandez is identical to the guest on your show right now, then I'm referring to one person, not two, because we're talking about identity. It's a one-to-one correlation. So let's say we're asking about some A and B. Now, according to Leibniz's law, if A is the same thing as B, then whatever's true of A is going to be true of B and vice versa. All the properties, all the characteristics. But in principle, if we can find something true of B that is not true of A, or even vice versa, well, then given Leibniz's law of identity, it would follow that they cannot be the same thing. So here's a thought experiment to kind of wrap your mind around this. Suppose you walk into a lab and you see two bottles of clear fluid. One is labeled water and the other is labeled chemical X. Now, let's pretend the label with chemical X was ripped off or you couldn't read it. And you want to ask yourself, are these two substances, are these two liquids, are they the same substance? Well, you know one is water, but you don't know what the other one is. So you see that they're both fluid, you see they're both clear, they both weigh about the same, and you come to the conclusion that they must be identical substances until you turn over the bottle of chemical X and on the back it says caution flammable. And you think, okay, well, I know that water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical X is, given Leibniz's law of identity, at the very least, I know that they cannot be the same thing. Now, with this in mind, let's look at consciousness. Like I said, there are 5 states of consciousness. You have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will. Now, if what my professor was saying is true, then whatever is going to be true of the mind is going to have to be true of the brain and vice versa, because remember, on his view, everything is either identical or reducible to something physical. So if the mind exists, and believe it or not, there are some people who will deny the existence of consciousness. Someone like Daniel Dennett comes to mind, Alex Rosenberg. But if you concede the mind exists and you're a physicalist, a strict physicalist, you're going to have to make the mind identical or reducible to something physical, and this would have to be something like the brain. Now, remember, Leibniz's law of identity. If two things in question are the same, then whatever's true of one is going to have to be true of the other and vice versa. But in principle, if we can just find one thing true of one that's not true of the other, they can't be the same thing. And when it comes to consciousness, this is something trivially easy to do. So we'll just do 3 examples. The first, let's take a state of my mind, like my thoughts and beliefs. My thoughts and beliefs can have the property of being true or false, but no region of my brain has a property of being true or false. It doesn't make sense to say that these group of neurons firing is true, but these other group of neurons firing, well, that group is firing false. That doesn't make firing is not a true or false kind of thing. Same thing with functions. You mentioned I debated Aaron Ron. We actually debated on the existence of the soul. And he said that the mind was just a function of the brain. And so I asked, well, how can a function be true or false? My engine running in my car is a function, but my engine doesn't function true or function false. It either functions or doesn't function, but there's no true or false to it. Now, let's look at the brain. Take a state of my brain. My brain can be in a state that weighs 3 pounds, but my thoughts or beliefs don't weigh 3 pounds. And the joke is, while you may be having heavy thoughts during this podcast, you won't have to buy a neck brace after we're done because you're having these heavy thoughts. My brain can be in a state that measures 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is a sensation in my mind, is not 7 inches long. It makes no sense to ask how many inches long is the taste of a banana or the smell of a rose. And while there's many, I mean, we could do the whole episode just on this, but while there's many more examples and other aspects of consciousness that make it different from something physical, the point is simply this: if all the properties of my mind are not physical properties, and all the properties of my brain are physical, well, it follows that if consciousness exists, then it cannot be identical nor reducible to something physical, and hence there must be something to ground it, something like a soul. So, given the first point, consciousness is not physical. And again, what is that? Well, there's 5 states: thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will. And I mentioned earlier, why 5? Well, this kind of seems to be what everything falls under. And why these 5? Because take something like thoughts and beliefs. Again, using Leibniz's law of identity, how do we know that thoughts and beliefs are something different enough to place them in different categories? Well, consider this: I can have thoughts I don't believe, and I can have beliefs that I'm not currently thinking.
Mm.
So they're different in their certain respects to where you can say, okay, they're not the same thing. Thoughts and beliefs are not the same thing, though there's correlation or overlap. So that would be the first point: is that consciousness is not physical. And I'll see if you want to say anything or add or push back or ask questions on that.
So, some folks might their pushback might be something like, "Hey, what you're doing is you're kind of sneakily removing this from the study of science into your own kind of realm of religion. Generally, that's the accusation, or philosophy, and then there you can dabble with the ideas and the concepts and all that stuff. But in science, you can't do that. So you're trying to kind of play home field advantage. Why is it, and you spoke about this a little bit, but just like clarifying it, why is it that it just is, this is a thing that science cannot study? It's impossible for it to study this. Rather than you're moving the goalpost, essentially, right? Like that's the accusation.
Yeah. So the question, when it comes to philosophy of mind, there are essentially 2 questions that anybody who wants to explain the nature of human beings, there's essentially 2 questions they need to answer, or at least 2 questions. The first is, what is consciousness? And the second is, what is a thing that possesses consciousness? What is a thing that grounds its existence? And of course, or what is the I or self? Now, these questions are not questions about physics, they're questions about metaphysics. And that's the difference. Science does not touch metaphysics. Now, there can be some correlation that you can discover in a posteriori sense, which means after the fact. We won't necessarily get into that, but we can put it this way: any conclusions, you have different positions within the philosophy of mind. You have physicalist, dualist, something called property dualist, panpsychist, all these other kind of views. But here's the kicker: is that take something like physicalism and substance dualism. Whatever conclusion one comes to by looking at the data, both positions are what you would call empirically equivalent theories. What does that mean? It means that both sides are going to agree on all the scientific empirical data. We're going to agree on all the data, and our conclusions will differ, but they will be conclusions on the basis of philosophical assumptions, not scientific assumptions or discoveries. In other words, both myself and the physicalist will not disagree on any point of empirical data, because again, these are not questions of physics, they're questions of metaphysics. So if you hit me over the head, yes, you're going to mess up, I may lose some brain cells, you may mess up something with my neuron connections. And the physicalist and I agree with it, and we agree that that's going to make us dizzy, can make us lose our memory. We agree on all of this, but then the conclusions is going to be philosophical in nature, not scientific. So Michael Ruse, a philosopher, atheist philosopher of science, he says, one of the quotes he says I like is that he says, "Science does not ask certain questions, so it is to no surprise that it does not give certain answers." And then you have also even atheist scientists kind of essentially conceding this point, that when it comes to questions of consciousness, this is why you have what's called the hard problem of consciousness. Basically, what is it and where did it come from? Now, I think there is a hard problem of consciousness, but I think it's a hard problem for the naturalist, not for the Christian. Because if the foundation of ultimate reality resides in the existence of an immaterial, unembodied mind, then it's no leap or stretch to say this is what gave rise to all the other finite minds. By contrast, if all you have, as J.P. Moreland puts it, is in the beginning were the particles, then you're not going to have chunks of matter coming together, forming more complicated chunks of matter, and just getting consciousness squirting into existence from just rearranging parts like Lego bricks. So here you have this hard problem of consciousness, which is essentially the question, where does it come from? What is it? But again, it's a problem for the naturalist because he has nothing within his ontology that is anything even remotely like consciousness. We could describe everything about the physical universe without ever having to appeal to consciousness. So there seems to be no need nor room for this, as Paul Churchland puts it. There
Hmm.
seems to be neither room nor need for anything immaterial to explain anything about ourselves. So why is this not smuggling in philosophy, so to speak? I find when people kind of use that accusation, it's almost like they're saying, "Hey, this is too convenient for you." And my response is, "Well, truth can be convenient
Yeah,
sometimes, and that's
correct.
okay."
When you're the one when you're the one believing the truth, of course it's convenient. Um,
Right, absolutely. And you have Nobel Prize winners in neuroscience, someone like John Eccles, and you have some of the world's leading neuroscience, Mario Beauregard, Jeffrey Schwartz. These are guys who are dualists, and yet some of the leading neuroscientists in their field when it comes to believing in a dualist position. So, in other words, one cannot say that a belief in the soul is due to scientific ignorance when you have some of the leading scientists in this field who do believe in the soul. And they will say, yeah, this is a question for philosophers, not neuroscience. And I think there are some interesting empirical or data that we can look at that I would say does lend credibility to a dualist position. But at the end of the day, everybody's going to agree on all what the data looks like, but our conclusions are going to differ philosophically, not scientifically.
correct. We're going to interpret the facts depending on the worldviews in which we're coming at them from. So let's just say there's consciousness. Consciousness is somehow related to this non-physical, immaterial thing we're calling the soul. There's a big difficulty that arises here in the sense of, cool, but we know for sure we have a given. We know we have a body. And we know we have this immaterial thing. How are they relating to one another? Right? How are they connected with one another? What is that connection point?
Yeah, so good question. This is known as the interaction problem, essentially. And I think it was Hasker, another great philosopher of mine, William Hasker, who said that there is no other, when it comes to philosophy of mind, there is no other argument that is overrated and overused than the interaction problem and overstated. Because essentially, so let's kind of take this and see where do we place it within this question that we have so far. Because so far, let's just say, for the sake of argument, we've established, consciousness is not physical and it exists. Now, the question then becomes, because we haven't gotten to the soul, the second point is, I am more than a brain and body. But even
Correct.
just here at this point, you have the question of essentially, okay, how does it interact? But note, this question would only come about after whether or not we've decided if it exists. In other words, if we're conceding it exists, then the question of how does the soul interact with the body is not a question that stands or falls in proving whether or not the soul exists. It's an epistemological question of how something works, not an ontological question of whether or not something
So
exists.
even if we don't know how it works, we just know that it does work. We're fine with it. We just say, hey, I don't know how
Yeah.
it works, but clearly it's working.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. That's in other words, even if we just went that far, I think that's sufficient because I don't know how my car works. I'm not a mechanic, but I drive it every day.
Correct.
It
And
works.
the normalcy of this, I guess, is that we on a daily basis use probably 1,000 things that we don't know how it works. I mean, I got a computer in front of me and you have one in front of you and mics and all this stuff. Like, I don't know all the details. Like, I don't know what all the details of this microphone is. All I know is it's plugged in. I hit a button, bam, it's working, right? And I don't need to know how it works for me to say that it does work. It is the case. So that was
That's right. That's right.
at the very least we're saying that you can plead ignorance and actually believe in the thing.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So this is why it's at least to me, at least it's somewhat astounding that so many non-believers or people objecting to this place so much emphasis on that as if this is somehow a defeater or a gotcha. Um, because again, it's a epistemic question, not an ontological question. Now, setting that aside, um, there's a few ways that one could respond to something like this. The first is to say that um, that this is just a primitive basic action, what's called a primitive action. So, in other words, when the person asks, "How does it interact? How does a soul interact with the body? Something physical?" They may be assuming that there's some type of intervening mechanism. So, if I say A causes B or interacts with B, and someone says, "Well, how does that happen?" They may assume there's some intervening mechanism, and I could say, "Well, A interacts with B by way of C." But note that doesn't solve the problem. It just pushes back the goalpost because now the question is, well, how does A interact with B? How does A interact with C in order to interact with B? And how does C interact with B and, caused by A and whatnot? But then even after you answer that, then you have to ask, okay, and how does that happen? In other words, there's a few options when it comes to this. And one is you can lead to an infinite regress, which means the action would never happen. Or we can use Occam's razor and say, well, it's just a primitive basic action. Even if we don't know how, we can say that A just causes B or interacts with B directly without any type of intervening mechanism. Again, even if we don't know how. On top of that, they may be looking for something physical, but again, you have the same problem of either it being an infinite regress, and some even assume what's known as causal closure. So if there's no God and there's nothing immaterial, and physicalism is true, Jack Kim has argued, then we have to satisfy the law of what's known as causal closure, which we can essentially say it is a view that every physical event must necessarily have a prior physical cause. And I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself here because this is where I get into the argument for free will, where essentially, if you have a neuron firing in your brain, and that neuron, those group of neurons is what makes, Aristotle said this, and forgive me for jumping all over the place. Aristotle said, if I move a rock with my staff, then we can explain that the rock was moved by the staff was moved by the hand, I moved my hand, but then the question is, what moved me? And in this chain of events, I would say this: the physicalist has a few options, because what is free will? Well, free will is essentially you are the first cause, the source of your will or actions. If I raise my hand and I was the one that caused it, I had free will. But if you shock me with a taser and my arm goes up, well, then I was caused by something external and prior to myself, and that doesn't qualify as free will. So how do we explain me moving the hand to move the staff to move the rock? What moved me? Well, the physicalist can say, okay, well, there was some neurons firing in the brain, and that made the hand move, that made the staff move, that made the rock move. And that started within me, so I'm the first mover, I have free will. Well, the problem is, given the law of causal closure, if every physical event necessarily requires a prior physical cause, well, then neurons firing are a physical event, so now you have to ask the question, what caused those neurons to fire? And again, he can posit another set of neurons firing to explain that set, but same problem, and so on and so forth. So again, you have this problem of an infinite regress, in which case the action becomes impossible. But given that we saw the rock move by the staff in the hand and by me, well, then that first option isn't available. So what's the next option? Well, I'd say the only other option is that you'd have to say at some point in this chain of events, no matter how many sets of neurons you want to posit that fired, at some point, there was some physical event external and prior to myself that caused these group of neurons to fire, and then that caused the hand to move, the staff to move, the rock to move. But now you're no longer the first mover. Now you're just an intermediate link in this chain of events. And if you're not the first mover, you can't have free will. So if there is nothing like a transcendent soul that is beyond transcendent to the body that can act on the physical as a first mover, well, then you have to give up the notion of libertarian free will. Now, some naturalists do give it up, so who cares? Well, some naturalists also claim to be free thinkers. And the irony is that if there is no free will and determinism is true, then every thought and belief you've ever had was causally determined by something external and prior to yourself, which means the last thing you can call yourself is a free thinker. Yeah. So these people would have to concede they did not freely choose to become an atheist. They were causally determined to, and they had no other option.
And other than that, they can't blame me for being a theist as well, because then I'm caused to be not only a theist, but a Christian. So what's the point of having these conversations anyways? It
That's right.
kind of leads you to this weird stalemate where you can't tell me I'm wrong. Well, you're going to tell me I can't tell you I'm wrong, but I disagree with you, so I'm going to tell you you're wrong anyways.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And so, yeah. So I say, so you're essentially, there's two price tags that this person's going to have to give up. One is what I'd call like an intellectual integrity or a rational responsibility, and the other would be moral responsibility. So, interesting story. I was at a Christmas party once, and that a friend of mine invited me to, and I was introducing myself to some people. And for whatever reason, everybody who talks to me always wants to talk about God and apologetics. I don't know
Well,
how that happens, but it just
that's,
comes out.
you know,
And so the guy heard I was a Christian, and he just felt the need to share with me that he used to be a Christian, but he's now an atheist. And I said, "Oh, and what led you to that?" And essentially, there were two things he said. One, that religion was a cause of war and evil and all this other stuff, and oppressing people's rights and so forth. And the second was a realization that we never had free will to choose which religion we were part of, because people are Christians because they're born in America, and if you're born over here, you'd be a Muslim. And at the end of the day, it's all already determined, so you're not even free to choose what to believe. So why believe in any of it? And as I'm listening to him, I did what I call the lazy approach. So keep me in your prayers. Next year, I'll have a book coming out on witnessing to non-believers, or conversing with non-believers. And I have what I call the lazy approach. And I said, so I start by asking questions. I said, so let me see if I understand. There are two main factors that led you away from Christianity. One was the belief that religion is a cause of evil and wars and oppressing people's rights. And the second was that we don't have free will. He said, yeah. And I said, okay, and how did you learn this? He's like, oh, I spent so much time studying. I read the Bible. I read, neuroscience. So he's spending all this time looking at the evidence. And he says, I want to be rational. I want to follow the evidence where it leads. I said, okay, gotcha. I said, okay, well, a few things confuse me. I said, on the one hand, you're claiming that these people who do these religious atrocities, they should be held accountable, right? He says, absolutely. And I said, okay, but if there's no free will, how can you hold anyone responsible for what they do? How can there be any moral praise or blame? And his eyes just kind of widened, like he had never, like the thought never crossed his mind. And I said, and here's the second thing. You're telling me that one of the other things that led you away was this belief that there is no free will, and that no one's ever free to believe any of these things to begin with. I said, but if there is no free will and you're claiming to have followed the evidence, then I can't help but ask if you freely came to believe in the conclusion that there is no free will. And he said, yes. And then he paused and says, wait, no. And then he was just kind of confused. Now, I'm not trying to argue with the guy. What I'm basically is trying to do is show the incoherence of his entire position, showing that the very thing that he claims led him away from Christianity are the two very things he cannot claim to have on his worldview that he has now come to hold. And so the irony in all of this is that and we started with the interaction problem, was essentially, okay, yeah, you could bite the bullet and say there's no soul, but now you're going to have these problems. And I'm not saying that's why we should believe in it, but I say that that gives credence to the belief in the soul, because we haven't even gotten to other possible responses yet. But essentially, you can't claim intellectual integrity. I became an atheist on the basis of following the evidence. No, you were just causally determined to, and you were causally determined to believe that you were following the evidence. But you could have read, a children's book and said, well, that's evidence there's no soul. It was all determined. And you can't claim to be more rational than the religious lunatic yelling that the world is going to end, on the street corners every Sunday, or the homeless person yelling that, everybody's going to hell. You can't claim to be more rational than they
Mhm.
are, because your thoughts and beliefs are no different than your hands, feet, eyes, and teeth. They were all determined by something, evolved into this, and you can't take any kind of credit for it. And you were never free to believe anything otherwise. So that said, now let's look at, okay, the back to the interaction problem. That there are a few interesting responses other than the ones we've given. One was you could just say, I don't know, and that wouldn't prove or disprove there's no soul. The second is you could say, well, it's a primitive basic action. It just A directly causes B, and there's there's no intervening mechanism.
Mhm.
And then there's a few other ones. Because one thing some people will appeal to also is they'll say, well, this somehow breaks, the law of the conservation of energy. That if the soul did exist, it would have to create some new energy, and that can't happen. Well, that would also assume some, I would say, naturalist ideas of the world. That'd be one assumption first that the person would have to unpack. Same thing with cause or closure. But here's an idea: is that one, I think Moreland says something like, well, the amount of energy it might even create might just be so small it's undetectable. It could also be something like, it could be trivial in comparison to the amount of energy that's released. So I've heard Moreland say, imagine if there was like a switch on the Hoover Dam, and all you had to do is flip the switch, and it would release all the water from the Hoover Dam. Now, how much energy do you think would come from all that water being released? I mean, tons of energy. But how much energy did it take to flip the switch? I mean, in comparison, nothing at all. And he says what could be the case, one possibility is that the amount of energy the soul produces is like flipping the switch on the Hoover Dam. You're either not going to detect it or it's going to get lost with all the energy that's released, whatever the soul does. So it could just be, taking the energy that's there and just maneuvering it and so forth. Another interesting answer is alludes to the notion of quantum entanglement.
Okay.
Now, quantum entanglement is the idea that there are two objects so far related by distance that there's no transfer of energy. But the interesting thing is that when you observe or measure one of them, it seems to cause the other one to do something in the opposite direction or the opposite state, something to that effect. So basically, there is no energy transfer, and just by observing or measuring one, it causes a reaction to happen in the other. And again, there's no energy, transferred to anything like that. So there's different interesting views, and there's people way smarter than me, which isn't necessarily too hard to do, who've looked into these things. But at the end of the day, I think it's a primitive action personally. I think those other answers are interesting, and no arguments for the soul stand or fall on whether we can explain it or on using one particular answer to explain these things.
Okay. Um, let's shift gears here a little bit. I'm gonna see if there's any questions that we might or comments that we might reflect on before we switch gears.
And there's a few other arguments that I can use for the second point if you want me to get into that as well.
I think that's fine. Okay, there's an interesting subject I think that deals with neuroplasticity. Um, and neuroplasticity as an argument for the existence of the soul. Okay? The idea here being that your neural pathways can be damaged and broken, all that stuff, and then they can recreate or create new ones. But the way they create new ones is by you thinking in a certain direction, and that would mean that your thinking comes before the physical kind of connections, therefore it's not physical, and it's beyond that, it's immaterial, but it's having a cause on the material, clearly the case. And then that leads into like spiritual transformation and transformation of the mind and all sorts of really cool spiritual kind of stuff, behavioral change and all that.
Yeah.
How does the naturalist account for something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to just kind of even unpack that notion further. So one of the guys I mentioned earlier, Jeffrey Schwartz, he's one of the leading researchers in the world on things like OCD, anxiety, and depression. And essentially, people with these conditions, their brain's wired differently. The chemistry of their brain is set up differently. And who was it? I forget his name. There's another neuroscientist. I've heard him say neurons that fire together, wire together. And essentially, suppose you have a person who's struggling with anxiety, and every time when they see it rain, your average person may think, oh, I might get wet, whereas a person, to over exaggerate for the sake of making the point, a person with anxiety may say, oh, it's raining, I might drown today or something like that. And what begins to happen is every time they have these anxious thoughts, especially when there's a certain stimuli being received, it digs a groove into the brain. And the more this happens, the deeper and deeper that groove is dug in the brain, to the point where the person doesn't even have to reflect anymore. It just becomes second nature to have these emotions or reactions or sensations every time a certain type of stimulation is being received. Now, this for someone like with OCD, this is debilitating.
Hmm.
This is why, I mean, they know they need to go to bed, but they're checking, to make sure they've set their alarm 50 times, in an hour or something like that. I mean, and it really is that bad. But every time they're doing it, it kind of satisfies their anxiety or their OCD, but then it's going to come right back and they got to do it again. It's like a fix they need.
Hmm.
Now, what Schwartz has done is he did this experiment, and you can see the pictures in his book. He has one called "You Are Not Your Brain," and I think another one, "Brain Lock," where he takes a brain scan of his patients with OCD, and I think it's a month or so. He does what's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and he has this like what he calls like a 4-step process of essentially what he the prescription, if you will, that he gives them is every time you have these thoughts come to you. And what's interesting too is that these people know when these thoughts are being induced by their anxiety or OCD, or these are thoughts they're having naturally. What do I mean by that? We're talking about consciousness, and another feature of consciousness is what's called first person introspective awareness. That essentially means that I've heard Moreland put it this way: a neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, but he cannot know more about my mental life than I do, because the
Correct.
only access to my mental life is through me, the first person subject. You cannot access it through a third person observer.
Meaning the
So,
doctor sitting in front of you, the scientist sitting in front of you, is going to
right,
have to ask you questions for you to
that's
tell
right.
them, here's what's going on.
That's right. That's right. Just similar to an eye doctor, even.
Yeah.
They can look at your eyes, but they're still going to have you do that test where you cover one eye. And they say, "What is this number?" And you say, "Oh, it's a 3." They're not going to say, "Nope, you're lying," or "You're dumb. It's an 8." No, they trust that you are presenting to them what the quality of the state of consciousness that you see. They're trusting you're being accurate with that, and that's how they know what glasses to give you. And so you can crack open my brain and see you can crack open my skull and see my brain, but you can't crack open my skull and see my thoughts.
Correct.
There's a joke that an astronaut goes up to or no, a neuroscientist goes astronaut goes up to a neuroscientist and says, "I've been to space many times, I've never seen an angel." And the neuroscientist says, "Well, I've done many brain surgeries and I've never seen a thought." So these are not things they have no physical properties. Now, back to Schwartz. What he does is he says, when you have these thoughts that are being brought upon you by your condition, he basically gives this like step process of how to recognize it and how to kind of challenge your thoughts essentially. And then after they did this successfully for about a month, he took another brain scan, and what he noticed was that the chemistry of the brain was different, and they had, in a literal sense, rewired their brain in many
Mm.
aspects by challenging and thinking differently. Now, this is known as neuroplasticity, like you mentioned, that neurons can, connect, reconnect, stretch, and just do interesting different things. But there was nothing that caused it physically per se. There was something, in other words, there were these thoughts that cause these things to change. So here you have this interesting example, this phenomenon, really. Yeah, even with something like the placebo effect, there's a great book called The Spiritual Brain, I believe. Mario Beauregard, and I forget who else wrote that. But it talks about how by doing these mental activities, you can literally change the chemistry of your brain, and you can change the physical outcomes of things. So this would show, I'd say, this is the empirical stuff I'm talking about, that you have this soul that is ontologically prior to the body. It is transcendent to the body, and it is a thing, like I said in my definition, that possesses consciousness that animates the body, and it's a thing that is in control, if you will. Now, you even mentioned how this applies to spiritual formation. Well, the Bible says to renew your mind, right? The Bible says to take your thoughts captive. That sounds like cognitive behavioral therapy. That sounds like, when I beat my flesh into submission, or Paul says in Romans 7, what I want to do, I don't do, and what I don't want to do, I end up doing, and I realize there is nothing good within me. That is my flesh, he specifies, but my inner man, his spirit, he says, I want to do these things, but I have to deal with my flesh, and it looks like here he's talking about substance dualism. and talking about how there are proclivities of his flesh, and this is also goes into present yourself as a living sacrifice, presenting the members of your body to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So you are literally presenting the parts of you that need fixing, just like you would present your brain to a neuroscience, for help. You're presenting these things to God and saying, I need help with these, and working on them in various aspects. And this goes into spiritual formation, renewing your mind. And again, that could in itself could be a whole other show.
Correct. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I
So
mean,
so
it deals
without
with habits, and it seems to me that when I read literature of whatever, like 1600s, you're reading someone talking about sanctification, and they're explaining about your stuff and the changes that are happening. It's like, oh, I think that's what's happening, right? They might not have the lingo, they might not have whatever the science to back it up, but it seems to be that's what's happening, and then you see that in the scriptures as well. Here's the way I want to shift our attention, because quite a bit and quite often when I talk and share with people and I say, well, I believe that I have a body and I'm a soul, I don't know, maybe 2 out of 5 people, depending on what kind of a community I'm in, somebody somewhere will be like, no, the Bible teaches that you have you are 3 in a Trinity. Like God is a Trinity. You are a Trinity. You are a soul, a spirit, and a body. Why is it that you're not that? What is that? How is? Let me backtrack. What's the difference between that view, what we call the tripartite view, and dualism, the bipartite view, and then why don't you think that's the case? And then I'll have a follow-up after that.
Yeah, no problem. So that's usually known as like you said, a tripartite or a trichotomous view.
Yeah.
And some people, gosh, I'm not going to mention names, even if I did, you don't know who they are, but I laugh because I've had this question many times. But someone said, well, it's like the Trinity. God's 3 persons, and you were body, soul, and spirit. And I said, well, we're not 3 persons. It's not an accurate analogy. I think it's a really bad illustration to use for the Trinity, first of all. And I think a lot of people tend to hold to that view because of the Trinity, which is it's like you're choosing your metaphysics on the basis of how good of an illustration or analogy it can be for some of your theology. But that aside, on the substance dualist view, and there are various versions of substance dualism.
Okay.
I'll say that up front. We won't go into those, but essentially they would all agree that there is something immaterial to you, and then there's a body. Now, note that on a substance dualist view, like the one I hold to, which I think Moreland calls a Thomistic-like dualism. I think is it Aristotelian metaphysics dualism, something like that. Basically, on the view that I hold to, I can exist without a body, and I will exist without a body in the intermediate state, which means having a body is not essential to my nature identity. Now, to be clear, because when I start talking about I am a soul that has a body, I'm not reducible or identical to a body. Some people say, well, how do you avoid going into Gnosticism?
Correct.
And I say, well, I just don't do it. You just don't go there. I
just don't view my physical body as just like an evil thing, or anything physical
exactly.
as evil. That's
right.
simple.
Exactly. There's no implication to dualism and Gnosticism. Just because I'm not a body doesn't mean all of a sudden the body's a bad thing. So I will say this, is that the most natural state for a soul to be in is embodied. We are naturally meant to be embodied. Nevertheless, Paul teaches there will be a state where we will be disembodied if we die prior to the final resurrection. So on the view of substance dualism I hold to, assuming that I will die before the final resurrection, I will exist disembodied. So having a body is not essential to my nature. Contrast that with like a hylomorphous view, where they would say that this composite, they're both necessary to be who you are.
Mm-hmm.
I disagree, but my point to all that is this. On my view, I am one thing, a substance. Now, contrast that with the trichotomous or tripartite view. Even if we were to say, though not entirely accurate, if we were to say on substance dualism there are 2 substances, physical and immaterial, the trichotomous or tripartite view will have to say there are 3 substances. A soul, a spirit, and a body. Now, when I tell people I'm a substance dualist, most trichotomists will say, "Oh, so you don't believe in the spirit?" And I say, "No, I do." Like, no, why would you say that? Of course I believe in the spirit. What do you mean? They're like, "Well, you only believe in two things." I'm like, "Well, no, I believe there's only two dominant things. There's a substance and a physical body." And even then, there seems to be something lost in translation because technically, on a trichotomous view, you would have to say there are three substances. And the question is going to have to become this: which one of those three are you? On the substance dualist view, I am the soul, and my body is something that I can exist without.
Hmm.
It can a body without a soul is a corpse. So we could say in that technical metaphysical sense, it's an inseparable part of me. But you can chop off pieces of my body, and I can be separated from my body. So at my core, I am a soul. Now, on the trichotomous view, I like to ask, which one are you? And sometimes they'll say, well, I'm the spirit or I'm the soul, whatever. Of course, they won't say I'm the body. But here's a problem. So when I explain to them, yes, I believe in a spirit, but I believe that the spirit is a faculty of the soul, much like my mind is a faculty of my soul. So if I were to ask you, what part of your body taste? Is it, or what taste? Is it you tasting, or is it your taste buds tasting?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a trick question because the answer is I am tasting by way of my taste buds, right? In other words, I am using a faculty of my body to taste, but it's me. It's a both and. Now, just like we have different faculties within our body, we have eyes to see, we have tongues to taste, ears to hear, and whatnot. I use those faculties of my body to do certain things. In the same way, my soul, think of it like a compartment of different drawers. My soul is a substance, me, and within my soul, I have faculties such as consciousness, and I have a faculty of spirit. And I would say it's that faculty of spirit is what gives me fellowship and communion with God. Now, if let's say the trichotomist and I agree, okay, yes, you communicate with God by way of your spirit. Well, then here's a question: if you're separating these two as two different substances, which one are you? Because if you're the soul, then if you're the soul and you got the spirit over here, and I don't mean to imply like a physical distance of separation, but if there's two substances,
Correct.
well, then when the spirit's praying, well, then that's not you praying because you're not the spirit, you're the soul. And they'll say, okay, well, I am the spirit. Okay, well, if you are the spirit, then whatever the soul does, like possesses consciousness, well, then who's that thinking? Because that's not you. In other words, you have to be one of these things. And if you're adding a third thing to it, if the trichotomist and the dualists agree, you can exist without a body. Okay, then now you got soul and spirit for the trichotomist. Which one are you? Because you have to be one of those. You can't be both.
It seems like there's no
Otherwise,
unifying factor.
right. That was going to be the next point, is that there has to be something that grounds and possesses all these things into one. Um, as on the substance dualist view, I am a soul, and the spirit is just a faculty of my soul, just like my mind, or just like my tongue is a faculty, and my taste buds is a faculty of tasting, my ears is a faculty of my capacity to hear, and things, and so forth. So I think the trichotomous view I think it's unbiblical, and I think it also has problems when it comes to the metaphysics of, well, which one of these three things are you, and what is the other guy doing while you're doing this over here,
What's the other guy? The other guy. They got this other existence sort of thing. I mean, this is partly why within the Trinity we have to be very careful as to how we explain it in regards to persons and natures, because there is a unifying factor when it comes to the Trinity of when we're talking about nature, and the distinction, the distinctness of the persons and unified in the nature of the things, where in this sort of a view, it like you separate it, that's great, but you can't put it back together if we want to use common language. And there's a linguistic argument, I think, to be made here biblically, that some of this stuff is interchangeably used in the Greek, soul and spirit. So in Armenian, it's very much kind of like the Greek. And so so hoki is a word in Armenian. You can think of it like hoki, Hoki.
Did you call me?
Yeah, I know. Or you can use a Q there, and it means a bunch of things depending on the context. So if you ask me, like, hey, how many people are there in the room? You would actually use that word, hoki. And then my response would be whatever, there's 8 hokis, right? But it also literally means, other than person, it also means spirit, literally, it means spirit. Like if I want to talk about my spirit, I would say that. Or if I want to talk about the Holy Spirit, I would use that word. And you can interchangeably use that word with soul as well. So soul and spirit, linguistically, it doesn't create this issue that maybe we see it in the English. And I think it's important that we realize the Greek of the Bible and context matters depending on what's talking. The same word could be used, or multiple words could be used talking about the same thing, without developing a theology and somehow trying to stick that into like this Trinitarian argument, which is not, like you said, that good of an argument, because you have the three separate stuff, but you don't have the unifying factor. And in having the three separate stuff, it creates an issue of, well, which one of these three things are you? Right? Then
Yeah, and like you're saying,
Yeah.
that they're interchangeable, and sometimes I think it's called a synecdoche. I can look that up. Where sometimes the Bible is using part to whole relationships. Synecdoche. Part to whole relationships where there's emphasis on one part, but it's talking about the whole thing. Because like you were saying, pneuma, ruach, whether Greek, Hebrew, things like that, they can be interchangeable. But depending on what the emphasis of the text is, they might use different words. So, for example, if I said all hands on deck, I don't mean I want you to chop your hand off and throw it onto the deck. I want your whole body, but I'm emphasizing the use of the word hand to convey the notion or the idea that I want your service. I want your work over here. The reason I'm calling you is because I need your help, or I need a hand. I don't just need your hand. I need your whole body. In the same way, when the Bible talks about, the soul did this, or his spirit fell, or his face fell, his heart fell. Because when people say, well, the Bible talks about spirit, why are you just a dualist? I'm like, yeah, it also talks about mind. It also talks about the stomach. It also talks about the heart. It also talks about this, but we're not going to multiply entities of substances. They're all, like the language you use, it's all unified in a substance, namely me, the soul. So, when we're reading the scripture, there's going to be certain emphasis on some things as opposed to others, but that gets into a little bit more technicality of the exegesis or the context or the language and how it's been used. But like I said, oftentimes it can be interchangeable. I do find it interesting. I don't know how much metaphysics we can take from this, but God put the breath into Adam, into what he made from dirt. He didn't breathe twice, right? He breathed once. So even there seems to be this implication of there's two things at play here, something physical and something spiritual.
Yeah. So in recent times, I've become a lot more, I don't know what words, passionate wouldn't be the right word, interested in an argument for God's existence from consciousness, where, it's a bit different. You don't hear it as often. Plenty of times, we hear the cosmological argument, and we hear argument from design and morality and all these things. One of the things we don't hear quite often is an argument for God's existence from consciousness. Now, this is something that you've brought up. You've brought it up in debates. You've brought it up in conversations. I want you to kind of run through that quickly, and why you think it's a good argument in the first place.
Yeah, it's a bit of a. So I think Moreland's argument is one of the best formulations of it, which is a bit technical. I don't have it memorized off the top of my head, but basically, in casual conversations or in like popular level debates, kind of like online discussions, essentially, there's a few ways to go around doing it. You can look at it like an epistemic chain. Here's one way. I would argue that in Moreland's book, actually, I think Consciousness and the Existence of God. This is a great book. It is a technical level book. It's made, I forget where he says it here, but yeah, it's a technical level book. If you're just getting into it, I would not recommend it. But there he essentially...
Maybe a simpler, just to recommend the simpler version of that book, which I've been listening to recently on Audible.
Well, so here's this is like
that's the one. Yeah, that's the one.
Popular level one.
Yeah.
My favorite though is this one here, Body and Soul. by Moreland. Um, but yeah, the consciousness and existence of God, that is a bit complicated. Um, but essentially, when you look at the naturalist ontology, I would argue that if there is no God, the most logically consistent position for one to take is to be a physicalist. This is what Paul Churchland argues and points out, and other atheists. So essentially, we have no reason to believe in anything immaterial. Some might argue for emergent properties. That's a whole other discussion. But essentially, um, at some point, the naturalist is, if he's going to be logically consistent, he's going to either have to punt to mystery, or just call it a brute fact, or essentially concede that these things shouldn't exist in our framework, anything immaterial like that. So we can put it this way: take something like consciousness. I was talking to a non-believer who was a naturalist, and I started by asking him this. I said, if there is no God and atheism is true, would you agree with me that nothing immaterial should exist? And he said, yeah. I said, nothing like angels, souls, demons, nothing like that. He said, yeah. I said, okay. So far we have, if atheism is true, nothing non-physical should exist. And I said, okay. And would you agree with me, though, that by the same token, this would also imply that if something non-physical did exist, well, then atheism couldn't be true. And he says, and he thought for a second, he goes, yeah, I guess that would follow. I said, okay, great. And he says, okay, but like what? I said, well, I'm glad you asked. And we talked about consciousness, and we talked about what I told you earlier. And I said, so it seems to me then, if atheism is true, then consciousness shouldn't exist because consciousness is not physical. Consciousness does exist, therefore atheism isn't true. Now, this is like a backdoor approach because for this reason, if we say atheism is a belief that there is no God, and if atheism is false, then its negation is true, which is a belief that there is a God. So if atheism is true, consciousness shouldn't exist. Consciousness does exist, therefore atheism is false, therefore theism is true, God exists. That's one way to go about it. I know Moreland has, and I pulled up one of his sections. He has different forms of the argument. Here's one. He says, taken as a straightforward deductive argument, the argument from consciousness becomes the following. Mental events are genuine non-physical mental entities that exist. Premise 2, specific mental event types are regularly correlated with specific physical event types. 3, there is an explanation for these correlations. 4, personal explanation is different from natural scientific explanation. 5, the explanation for these correlations is either personal or natural scientific explanations. 6, the explanation is not a natural scientific one. 7, therefore the explanation is a personal one. 8, if the explanation is personal, then it is theistic. 9, therefore the explanation is theistic. So that's one version. Like I said, it comes from a complicated book. But even when you look at just the paradigm of what Moreland calls a grand story of naturalism, you don't have any room for consciousness, or it shouldn't be anything like the soul. And then again, as we talked earlier, when you get rid of things like consciousness of the soul, well, you can't have free will, you can't have moral praise or blame, you can't have intellectual integrity, rational responsibility. Some other arguments would be like identity through change that we didn't get into. The argument from the indivisibility of personhood, where essentially there are certain features about ourselves that we want to hold to. Like Jaguar Kim here, I'll briefly go into one of those arguments I mentioned. Identity through change. So Jaguar Kim gave an interesting argument in his book, Philosophy of Mind, atheist philosopher. Where he's presenting the arguments for dualism, and one that he thinks is interesting. He says, in 2001, this brain and body did not exist. And he says that because we now know through science that virtually every cell, not every cell, but virtually every cell in our body is changed every 7 to 10 years. And Jaguar Kim says, well, in 2001, this brain and body did not exist. But I did exist in 2001. And what follows from that, well, then I'm not identical or reducible to this brain and body. So the question is, going back, let's kind of put these together with like moral praise or blame. If I committed a crime 7 to 10 years ago, but they just now found the evidence today to convict me, and let's say Jay Warner Wallace comes to my door, and he says, we just found the evidence, I'm going to have to take you in. And how silly would it be for me to say, look, Jay, you know that we're just purely physical objects and that we don't retain identity to change. So whoever you're looking for is someone who existed 7 to 10 years ago, because I am now a new set of
Don't know who
properties
that
and
guy is.
parts. Yeah, yeah. Good luck. Go find him, but good luck. He doesn't exist. And of course, he's going to slap the cuffs on me. Why? Because we know that we do retain identity to change despite part replacement. And the only thing that could explain and ground that identity change would have to be something like a soul, and not something physical. And again, you have this
Yeah, the only
argument.
response some people might give to this is something like memories, right? Like memories are the things that keep that sort of a continuation happening. But the counter argument, it seems to me, is very simple to this, right? Like if somebody falls down and hits their head and loses, forgets the last 8 years of their life. It's like, well, is it this person? Or, people go into comas and come out and they don't remember who they are. Notice even the way we speak about that and those individuals. It's like, oh, that person has lost their memories. Like,
Exactly.
we will completely lose all reference points if we took that to be the case. If we took your memories are what make you you, we don't have any more reference. So who is the individual having the memories in the first place, right? Like it seems to be that there's a distinction, but there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so there's like three different views of identity through change. One is like the you can have like the body view, the brain and body view, or the memory view. But yeah, they all have their problems because like you just said, say you forget your memory. I was talking to an atheist once on her channel. She invited me on to talk about this, and she held to the memory view. And I said, okay, suppose you have this guy who's been married for 20 years, has 5 kids, they're in love, gets in a car wreck, loses his memory. I said, so on your view, this is a different person. She says, yes. I said, okay, so this guy's single now, has no kids, no relation. She says, yeah, I guess so. I said, okay. Now, let's say 5 months later, he gets his memory back. Does that mean that, let's say it's John ceased to exist, and 5 months later, John came back into existence, and whoever that temporary 5-month guy was, he stopped existing once John came back.
He's like John Prime 1 or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so you get into these metaphysical implications that are just so bizarre that I mean, I would say honestly are hoops and loops that the non-believer has to jump through to try and avoid this conclusion of there being something immaterial, there being a soul, and at the end of the day, that there being God.
Correct. Well said. Again, I love that argument. I think it's really fun to go in that direction. And I think people generally, because we are so aware of ourselves, we're so aware of our consciousness, that it's a really cool way of having that sort of a conversation. For those who don't realize, this stuff is all over our popular media and stuff like that. In recent times, if you are a Marvel fanatic or fan or whatever like that, you really saw a version of this kind of peek its head and sort of get ruined to a certain extent. But in the WandaVision series, right? It's like, what are we looking at? What is an identity if it's just completely made up based on memories or something like that? So,
well, I'm a Christian. I don't watch any of that stuff. So I don't know what you're talking about.
Sinners.
Yeah, but yes, in WandaVision, they did the ship of Theseus.
Correct.
So that's something I don't think we touched on, but it has to do with identity to change. So one thing I didn't touch on, but I'll briefly mention, is there's a difference between a substance and what's called an aggregate. Purely physical objects are aggregates. They are a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Something as simple as a pin. This is an aggregate. It has separable parts, and the difference between a substance and an aggregate is that to get a little bit technical, for aggregates, the parts exist ontologically prior to the whole, whereas for substances, the wholes exist ontologically prior to the parts. What does that mean? If I remove a tire from a car, it keeps its existence and identity as a tire, independent of its connection to the car. And what that shows us is that the parts exist before the whole comes into existence. You can lay all the pieces of a car on the floor, and they exist, and the car doesn't come into existence until you put them together. Now, the problem with this is that, or rather just the fact of the matter is that purely physical objects, aggregates, do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. Now, contrast that with the substance. I am a substance, and I as a whole exists prior to my parts. Animals are substances. Living things, traditionally speaking, were substances. So, when a dog's born, a puppy, it doesn't have all its parts yet, but it exists. Why? Because as a whole, it exists prior to the parts. But if you severed my arm, Aristotle argued, that arm will lose its identity as my arm, as a human arm, which is evident by the fact that in a few days it will cease to exist. So for aggregates, parts exist before the whole. For substances, the wholes exist prior to the parts. And this goes now into the ship of Theseus. If I replace, I use the example of a car, and I kind of add to the example just to make it clear. I ask people, if I change the tires of a car, is it the same car? Some people say yes. Okay. I'd say no, but in a popular sense, we could say yes. Metaphysically speaking, no. If I can switch analogies real quick, if you remove a wheel from a tricycle, metaphysically speaking, we'd have to say a tricycle has ceased to exist and a bicycle has come into existence. Now, that out of the way, change the tires in a car. People say it's still the same car. Okay. Now let's change every single nut and bolt of the car, every part of the car. Is it the same car? But before you answer that question, let's take the replaced parts and put those back together. Now you have two cars. And then my question is, which one of these two is the original, if any of these? Now, regardless of your answer, I think one thing is certain: they both cannot be the original. And that shows us at some point, one of them ceased to exist, if not both. But the point is, aggregates do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. So again, this goes back into the identity through change. If I'm either a soul or a purely physical object. If I'm a purely physical object, I do not retain identity through change, but I do retain identity through change. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul.
Correct. And there's all sorts of ethical implications of this. That's one of the things, like some people might sit there and they're like, hey, you guys are just, philosophizing and, it's annoying and stuff like that. And it's like, no, how we punish criminals. Abortion is a major,
yes.
The consequences of what you believe on this subject are going to determine on your views politically, your views about life, whether you say that's my baby in my womb, or whether that's the same baby that was in your womb and has now been born and is 3 days old, whether you can even say that. There's so many implications of this when it comes to the ethics of it that we have to have a position on this. The problem is that we live in a society where folks vote, they have opinions on these matters, and have no idea what's going on when it comes to the metaphysics and the conversation about it. And so therefore we get all sorts of confusing thoughts out there where wanting a child, for example, determines whether that's a human or not. Which seems like ridiculously arbitrarily and not very smart.
Right.
So here's an example that, the ethics of this. If a woman is in her car and she is driving to the abortion clinic and I run and she's going to go have an abortion, and I run my car into that woman and her child dies in the womb, I get tried for murder. But she was on her way to get an abortion. And if she gets there without anything happening and she has the abortion, she's not tried for murder, neither is the doctor. Right? This is where our legal system seems to be like ridiculously confused about these stuff. And you want to be consistent in your beliefs and how you apply the law. But there are many different ethical situations that this answers or it brings up or it gives clarity. And yesterday, we're going to end soon, but last night we were doing the Q&A, some people were asking about, robots being used for pleasure, let's just say, and whether the ethics of that and what that looks like. These things matter. The way we view what a robot is and what it even means for something to be like artificial intelligence, for something to be intelligent or self-aware or all of this comes back to exactly what we're talking about right now. Whether they have souls, whether they don't. Cloning is a part of this whole conversation. Animal cruelty is a whole part of this conversation, right? Like whether you're a vegan or not is a part of this whole conversation. It shouldn't be surprising to us that there are people who are vegans who refer to the killing of animals as murder because they have a certain metaphysics that they bring into the conversation that we don't all agree on. There's a really interesting ethical example that gets given between that has to do with, say, like generally Indian culture and cows and how they're sacred and so on and so forth. And that, and the comparison you make is that usually people, you give that example and say, we have different ethical frameworks. But in reality, you have the same framework. It's just being exposed to different ways. Because if I believe in reincarnation, then I'm not going to eat animals because those animals are reincarnated human beings, right? Say your grandma, possibly. But I also, in my culture, I don't believe that we should eat our grandparents anyways. So it's just a form that we're arguing over. We both agree that we shouldn't eat grandparents, but they believe in reincarnation and they think that animal is a grandparent. Mm-hmm. In comparison to my worldview, where the animal is the animal and not a human. So again, these things matter quite a bit. Eric, I want to thank you, man. I want to thank you for jumping on in here and just enlightening us and having this conversation.
Can I add to that too?
Yeah, absolutely.
What you said is, I like that you said, that we have these views about things without understanding the metaphysical implications. I think one thing that's interesting. So this may or may not get this video demonetized, so I apologize in advance.
Here we go.
So, transgenderism, is a hot topic these days.
Yes.
And essentially you have this idea that people are saying, I was born into the wrong body, or who I am does not match my body. Note the implication. So I disagree. First of all, I disagree with this idea, but just for the sake of argument, note the implication. They are conceding that they are not identical or reducible to their physical body. And by default, to even hold to something like this, you would have to assume ontologically some type of dualistic position of a soul and body. And if that's the case, then God must exist. And if God exists, I wonder what he thinks of this. He probably wrote a book talking about that. Let's see what he has to say before we kind of throw out our views on this. So I just find it interesting. But yeah, we have, our culture has these views of so many things without considering the metaphysical implications of what they're actually saying.
Yeah. So here's an idea: transgenderism as an argument for God's existence.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I can see that for sure.
I wonder how that video will do. I might actually work on that.
Yeah, I like that. I might have to use that in an argument or something. Next time I have a debate on a college campus, I think I might have to.
There you go. Because you're essentially saying you're trapped in a body, in the wrong body. But who's the you that's trapped? What if it's a soul?
Yes.
Well, if souls exist, non-physical things exist, immaterial things exist, then God exists because God tends to be the answer to why souls exist, or else you have an infinite regress. If God exists, then morality exists, then it gets flipped back on, does God have any intentions about sexuality?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. Whether it gets demonetized or not, that's a good point. Doesn't matter. So.
Right on, man.
Thanks,
thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a pleasure. I love it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys for hanging in here for this conversation. If you're watching the replay, hopefully you've enjoyed it. And we will have, I think, Eric back on again some other time to have some other discussions. And there's so many directions we can go into. I just wanted this to be a introductory kind of thing, and then we'll take it into all the different directions in the future. I want to thank you guys for hanging in there and going through it. If you have to watch this again, go ahead and watch it again. And I'll end it with this because Eric's in the chat. Go subscribe to his channel, please. He's got a YouTube channel as well, sure. And he posts his videos in there and his debates in there. So go to the Eric Hernandez. He's in comments. Click it, go there, subscribe, and follow him in the work he does. So with all that said, God bless you guys. Take care, and we will see you tomorrow.